Hello everybody, my name is Faye McGuinness. I'm the Head of Workplace Wellbeing Programmes at the mental health charity Mind. Coming to you today from my dining room, where I've probably had over 5,000 people over the past 6 months, which I never expected to happen. It's been a very interesting experience. But I'm really pleased to invite you today to join us for this Mental Health at Work Commitment webinar series. And Mind are delivering this series in partnership with the CIPD, Business in the Community, This Is Me, and the City Mental Health Alliance. So really proud to be working in partnership with our partners on this commitment series. And today's commitment specifically is looking at Standard 2, and it's being delivered in partnership between us at Mind and our colleagues at Business in the Community. So I'm really pleased that today we've got Louise Aston joining us, who's the Wellbeing Director at Business in the Community and has a personal passion about all things mental health at work. So really pleased to have Louise here. And we've also got Webb, who's the Group Safety, Health and Environment Strategy Director from Costain. Lawrence is going to share his experience of practically implementing this standard. So it's really great to have Lawrence here sharing his experience as well. So I'm just going to start today by setting the scene as to what the Mental Health at Work commitment is and why we launched this a year ago. So essentially the Mental Health at Work commitment is a series of 6 standards that we believe every employer should be implementing to prioritise the mental health and well-being of their staff. So it's a set of 6 standards. There's quite a lot in them, but actually what we believe is that they really help organisations think about how you promote well-being for everybody, how you tackle the causes of poor mental health at work, and how you provide mental support for people that have mental health problems. So it really helps organisations think about that whole system that they need to implement to make this a priority. And so why do we need to do that? So I'm going to tell you what the scene was before COVID, and Louise is going to come in and tell you what the state of play is now. But before COVID, we knew that 39% of people had said that they were experiencing poor mental health related to work. So work was the driver of their poor mental health. We also knew that 51% of people felt comfortable speaking generally in the workplace about their mental health issue, which meant that actually there's a large proportion of people still not feeling comfortable enough to talk about their mental health. What we also knew is that the cost of poor mental health at work for employers is £45 billion every year, and that £29 billion of that is made up of presenteeism. So actually people being in the workplace, but they weren't able to be as productive, or they weren't feeling as engaged because they're not working in the right environments that are encouraging and supporting their mental health. So what I say is that actually before COVID, we were already facing a crisis in terms of workplace mental health. So that's the reason why we launched the Mental Health at Work commitment a year ago. But we know that COVID has thrown up a whole range of new issues. And what we wanted to do with this webinar series is really help employers understand how they can implement each of the standards practically. So we hope at the end of this session, you're going to leave with some really useful practical tips about how you can implement Standard 2. And just a reminder of what Standard 2 involves. It talks about good physical working conditions. It talks about work design, conditions and culture. It talks about job design, working patterns and expectations. It talks about work-life balance and flexibility. And it talks about openness during recruitment and throughout employment. So throughout today's session, we're going to touch on some of these things to help you think about how you can do some of them. But before that, I'm going to hand over to Louise, who is going to set the kind of in the moment of COVID and what that's looking like in regards to workplace mental health. So over to you, Louise.
Hi everyone, I'm Louise Aston, really delighted to be part of this webinar series and great to be with Lawrence, who's on the other side of my fire pit, who we're going to be having a fireside chat shortly. So I think it's a great collaboration, Faye, and we're really delighted to be part of it. So Business in the Community's Wellbeing campaign basically has the mental health at work commitment is the spine of our campaign, and our leadership team have deliberately selected standard number 2 as a kind of focus for our campaign. Before COVID, it was possibly seen as the most difficult, but like so many things, COVID has acted as a really powerful catalyst to elevate mental health to the fore, but also to transform the way we work literally overnight. So for those of you who don't know Business in the Community, we're the Prince's Responsible Business Network, and our response to the pandemic is how we can support businesses to build back responsibly and build on constructive lessons learned during COVID. So this year's summary of key findings from our annual YouGov Mental Health at Work survey was conducted this August we've just had, in partnership with Bupa UK Insurance and Business in the Community's Wellbeing leadership team. So in terms of before COVID, in terms of years of campaigning that Faye and I have both been involved in, is what we were seeing was a massive rise in awareness of mental health, but it wasn't translating into mainstream action, and positive mental health wasn't being truly embedded into organisational culture. Is typically employers were going for the tactical low-hanging fruit, and actually in some cases the findings of our annual YouGov survey were actually moving in the wrong direction. So it goes without saying that the last 7 months have been some of the most challenging organisations have faced in a generation. But there is some good news, is that during the crisis, employers generally have really stepped up in their support for employee mental health. And these findings provide unique insight into how these challenges are affecting the mental health of employers at a pivotal time for business and the economy. So in terms of the state of the nation, so Faye basically mentioned that last year the 39% of employees who have experienced poor mental health related to work in the past year was 39% in 2019. Now you can see it's gone up to 41%, but actually that could have been a whole lot worse if actually employees hadn't felt as supported by their colleagues and line managers, who you can see from these stats have been super considerate of employee well-being. Rather kind of, well, unfortunately, is CEOs and boards haven't been perceived as being as supportive as colleagues and line managers. Yeah, so next slide, please. So overall, employers with mental health issues related to work has increased since last year, as I said, from 39 to 41% this year. And, you know, as I said, given the context of a pandemic crisis, this could have been a whole lot worse. 54% of employers experienced the symptoms of poor mental health that they felt were caused by factors outside of work. A higher proportion of those that were surveyed in 2019. But the pandemic has played a significant part in both work and non-work related causes of poor mental health. We know that 9% of work-related mental health issues were caused by COVID. And among those who experienced non-work related mental health issues, a third listed COVID as a cause for their symptoms. Next, please. So in terms of the causes of poor mental health where work was a contributing factor, so pressure is the top stressor for employees, but interestingly has slightly decreased in the last year. And women are more likely to list pressure as a key factor compared with men. And the second cause of work-related poor mental health is workload, long hours and lack of annual leave, which is a factor. But again, that's slightly gone down from last year. Next, please. So there's now more support and a willingness to talk about mental health, which is really positive news. Employers, whether supporting employees in virtual or physical workplaces, have really taken huge strides in providing valuable support. We know that basically 56% of employees now feel comfortable to talk about mental health at work. Again, a significant improvement in busting that stigma from 51% in 2019. And it's really positive to see that 63% of employers who told their employees about a mental health concern had a positive outcome, which is excellent. Next, please. However, there's an increasing number of employees who are not talking to anyone about their mental health issues. So this really is a case of people suffering in silence. So concerningly, 3 in 10 employees affected by poor mental health admit to telling nobody about it, which again is up from 27% in 2019. And this trend is higher in men compared to women. So although people are more comfortable speaking about mental health at work, there are those who are not necessarily reaching out for support. Next, please. And finally, despite employees feeling more supported by their managers and organisation and colleagues, 62% of managers at times had to put the interest of their organisation above the well-being of their colleagues. And maybe that is a pragmatic reality in terms of commercial considerations, but in terms of genuinely putting people first, is employers really must actually think about this agenda in terms of sustainable long-term human capital management. Next, please. So in summary, the way organisations manage and support mental health has improved significantly. This creates optimism as the nation's businesses continue to navigate through this evolving crisis. So whilst organisations have made impressive progress in the face of nearly 7 months of disruption, unfortunately, this second wave of the pandemic has now increased even more urgency for all organisations to continue to step up their efforts to support positive mental health in extremely difficult times, particularly in the dark, cold winter months to come. So basically, in terms of mental health support is needed even more now as the workforce remains dispersed across the country, home or hybrid working, and that's the new business as usual moving forwards, and workloads are changing, and for many job security is very uncertain. So in line with the survey findings, we're asking all employers to elevate mental health and safety on an equal par with physical health and safety, using the 6 standards set out in the Mental Health at Work commitment, is to tackle the systemic root causes of poor mental health, which, with the confidence of seeing the nature of work literally change overnight, is to be bullish enough to redesign jobs that promote long-term mental health, building on the new ways of working since COVID, and avoiding employee burnout by reducing pressure and workload. And then the third thing is, we've seen with the pandemic, it's also acted as a catalyst in terms of, we've seen a spike in domestic abuse, we probably, if you look at what happened in the last recession in 2008, also see a rise in suicide and obviously a massive increase in death and bereavement. So these are all difficult issues that have come out of, well, have been magnified by COVID that employers need to consider. Next, please. Next, please. So as I said, we're treating the Mental Health at Work Foundation as the spine of business in the communities wellbeing campaign, and really urge you to sign up to the commitment. It's basically a crucial tool for all organisations to really actually make this year the start of a trend and not an exception in terms of the improvement of mental health. And then finally, Mind have produced this really great guide to mental health at work commitment guide for employers during the coronavirus. So I'd now like to hand back to you, Faye, please.
Great, thank you, Louise. That was really, really helpful in setting the kind of current context. And I think, like you say, some really promising signs there in terms of how employees are feeling around how their employers are supporting them. And we really want to grow on that and grow this movement so that that continues for years to come. And I should have said at the very beginning, you think I would have done enough of these, remember to say this, but please do put question and answers in the chat if you have any of them. We are going to obviously have question and answers at the end of the session. And as we've said in the chat, we are recording this session, so we're able to share it with you afterwards, and you can share it with your organisations and your networks too. So now that we've kind of done some of the scene setting and we've kind of spoken about what the current picture looks like, we wanted to touch on what good practice could look like. So I'm going to start by talking about Mind's Workplace Wellbeing Index, which is a benchmark of best practice that over 300 organisations have signed up to. And essentially this index looks at 6 key areas. And as you can see here on the slide, one of those areas is all around culture and engagement. And what the index does is it allows Mind to come into an organisation and do what I would call a very deep dive into the organisation's policies, practices, employee surveys, and really get to grips with actually what's going on within an organisation. So when we think about standard 2, and we think about actually tackling the causes of mental health at work, it's really important to understand the culture and engagement piece. And so I wanted to pull out an example of an organisation who achieved gold in the index, so that's the highest score that you can achieve, and that's E.ON. And E.ON, particularly in regards to this standard, have been looking at 3 particular areas. So they paid lots of attention to job design, structure and expectation. They've looked at their physical working conditions, and they've also looked at how they are able to get employee feedback on conditions and culture. And this has obviously really played out very well for them because they've achieved the gold. So what I wanted to do is just share an example of some of the stuff that they're doing. So excuse if the screen changes a little bit because I'm getting up my notes. But in terms of the attention to job design, structure and expectations, what they wanted me to feed back to this webinar is that they've adopted an agile approach to management in teams. So in essence, they've taken the traditional role of a manager and recognised that actually being all things to all people, when you have maybe 30 people in a team, doesn't necessarily work. So the way that they approached it is that they have set up 2 distinct roles. One which is about being a wellbeing lead, and one is about the kind of people management, your typical kind of people day-to-day management that you might see. So one is doing the process stuff and one is doing the people stuff. And actually they found that looking at the management role through this lens has really, really helped them improve the mental health and wellbeing of their teams, because they have somebody that is solely focused on how do we keep people well. And so I think that's a really good example of how they have actually looked at jobs and structured and designed them in a way that is better for mental health. And then in terms of good physical working conditions, they have obviously got many sites, over 38 sites they've got. So they've had to think about physical working space quite a lot. And what they did is that they looked at each site, they focused on their core values at E.ON, and so that colleagues felt that they could choose the culture or the working environment that they wanted to work in. They ran a site survey for every single one of their sites, and they took opinions, and then they developed the sites for each of those feedback surveys. So they actually listened to every office in terms of what each office felt that they needed for their mental health and well-being. So there's a requirement for a quiet room in every single office, and that's really important. They heard back that actually people didn't want on the toilets disabled access, but they wanted it to be called accessible toilets. So they changed those signs. So they really started to think about actually what are the questions we need to ask about the physical work environment, but let's not just have a blanket approach to all of our offices. Let's understand what people need individually. So I think that's really, really important. And then in terms of getting employee feedback on conditions and culture, they're really, really pleased that they've recruited 70 wellbeing warriors. And I love that name, wellbeing warriors. And effectively what those warriors do is they really drive the wellbeing strategy at the grassroots level. So they understand that actually to understand what employees want, you need employees on the ground talking to other employees. It doesn't always have to be management listening to employees. That grassroots is really important. So they wanted me to share with you that having that grassroots movement is really, really important. So that's just one example of an organisation that has started to think differently in this space. And I think it's really important. And what we're really keen to do is we're really keen to support organisations to link up to each other so that you're able to learn from these organisations about what they're doing. And I think that's really, really important. So I'm now going to hand back over to Louise, who's going to introduce Lawrence, and they're going to have a fireside chat. As you can see, they're by a blazing fire. And Lawrence is going to share his experience of implementing this standard at Costain. Over to you, Louise.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Faye. And great example from E.ON. So delighted to be sitting in our fire pit in Lawrence's garden. Is Lawrence Webb, is Group SHE Strategy Director at Costain, and basically Costain are also a member of Business in the Community's Wellbeing Leadership Team. Last year Costain was a finalist of our Responsible Business Wellbeing Award, and they were also an inaugural company who were one of the first to sign up to the Mental Health at Work commitment. So welcome, Lawrence. Lovely to see you, and I hope you're kind of toasty by the fire. So to get us started, Lawrence, could you tell us a bit about Costain, your role in the organisation, and your approach towards embedding employee mental health and wellbeing into organisational culture before the pandemic, please?
Yeah, no problem. Hi, Louise. Hi, everybody. So Costain is a smart infrastructure solutions provider. And basically what that means is our organisation works very closely with transportation, utilities, water, energy and other national infrastructure requirements to provide civil engineering, consultancy and sort of design solutions. So some of you might recognise Costain as being a very old organisation who traditionally came from a construction and building background, which is exactly right. My role in the business is very much to develop and implement our safety, health and environment strategy. So that's very much looking forward, doing research, working with organisations like BITC and other member organisations to basically formulate a much more forward-looking strategy than perhaps we've had before. And I've been really fortunate in that wellbeing actually sits under my remit, but I have the best form of leadership from our exec board in the form of our Chief Financial Officer, Tony Bickerstaff, who volunteered to take on the role to be the wellbeing lead for the entire business. And that straight away set a very, very clear tone And this was about 5 years ago, where we actually started to move into a place where it was becoming quite obvious to us that being in an industry that typically always focused on physical health, things like dust, noise, vibration, musculoskeletal disorders, that actually there was a much bigger issue being, that needed more attention, and that was mental health. And where our journey started from was a member of my team actually volunteering to provide a case study to the rest of the business on one of our twice yearly stand downs. And he wanted to explain that somebody who was a massive advocate of health and well-being, he was actually coming out of the other side of a breakdown personally. And he wanted to tell his story about how people in Costain, through our sort of typical family feel, had actually picked him back up and supported him, and had really helped him turn his life around. And that first conversation, that first real case study, was the one that made everyone stand back and go, oh wow, actually it's all right to talk about this stuff. And I'll be honest, having been in industry for so many years, I never expected that to happen, but that first conversation changed everything. So really important to have that strong leadership, and then it filtered down through the rest of the business. And that sort of 5-year journey has got us to a point where before COVID, it was okay to say that you weren't great. We put in place lots of mental health first aiders and wellbeing champions, although I like warriors better. I think I might steal with pride there. And we put a framework in place to make sure that mental health was just a normal thing that everybody had. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. And the mental health at work commitment for us was the sort of next logical step to take all that pre-work that we'd done and get us ready to make the big jump from traditional health into a true world of well-being. And it's only a first step. So by the time COVID came along, we were about 95% of the way down the journey to be able to flick that switch in March. And we were very fortunate in that we managed to change ourselves as a business within a week, because I'm sure many of you have as well, in a situation that normally would have taken probably 12, 18 months, because it's about culture and it's about behaviours. And we have a very, very strong behavioural management background that sits throughout the business. So plugging mental health as just being a part of our day-to-day business, along with the importance and the understanding of behaviours, meant that back in March, we were ready to make that jump.
That's brilliant, Lawrence. And I mean, clearly Costain already had really solid foundations in place before COVID came along. What I'm really interested in terms of COVID acting as this sort of catalyst to accelerate what Costain was already planning to do anyway, is how are you going bolder and faster in relation to ensuring good job design and good work drive positive mental health outcomes? And can you tell us a bit about what KPIs, what leading metrics you're using?
Sure, no problem. Well, I think COVID is an international, tragic, absolutely tragic scenario. However, the one thing that I think people need to take away is the fact that this sort of terrible situation has made everybody take stock, stand back, reflect, and change en masse through the absolute requirement. So we are taking that opportunity to not think about the way things were anymore, because it's not going to be like that. So it's actually helped us accelerate our journey because of one, necessity, and two, the fact that in talking to all of our people, nobody wants to go back to the way it was. It's actually provided a fantastic opportunity for us to be more in touch with our people than ever. If I'm being honest, we've run surveys where people have said they feel more connected now than they did previously. So us being very empathetic as an organisation, which we've always been, has come right to the forefront. So it's actually our people helping us drive things going forwards, because we're well connected with them. We take a lot of their feedback, having reflected, we push it back to them as individuals, as groups, as teams, whatever's needed. And they can actually see that we're moving forward based on the suggestions they're bringing in. Now, the thing that really drives performance for us again, is coming back to the behavioural aspect, but also it's being able to measure how engaged people are. So we constantly measure engagement, because we've proven over the years that the more engaged our people are, the more that our incident rates, for example, go down, the more that our sickness absence goes down. And the reason for that is because people are having very proactive and early conversations about the things that are really important to them with their line managers than perhaps they were before. So one of the key things for us is taking that connectivity and that change and basically making it business as usual, that there is no going back. It's all about sort of looking forward. What we've tried to make sure of is that in our journey to move from traditional occupational health into the much wider world of well-being, we're putting tools in place driven by leading metrics such as return to work conversations in relation to sickness absence rates and these sorts of things. We've got a constant drip of initiatives and messaging and communication that's just becoming day-to-day business. So people are seeing this as something which is now, I hate to say this phrase, but the new normal, because it really is. It's not a bolt-on or something we're trying to do. It is literally just what we do. So dynamic working, flexible working, saying I'm going to go for a jog at lunchtime. So do you know what? I'm not going to attend 4 or 5 back-to-back Teams meetings all day because I do have a life. Having those sort of open conversations with your line managers and being able to have line managers in a place where they can have those conversations, not take it personally, take it as constructive, and then reorganize the way that they work are all things that we've been doing. And I tell you, it's just changed the face of our organization, and it's getting us ready for our constantly changing future, in my opinion.
That's great. Thank you, Lawrence. Is what I'm really interested in is obviously in terms of, you know, a lot of the work that Costain does isn't office based, it's actually on site.
Yeah.
And in terms of what we talk about, hybrid ways of working, taking that tailored, personalized approach, one size doesn't fit all. And conversation that I've had with several companies is how do we avoid that two-tier approach for frontline workers and employees working from home?
Yeah, it's a really good conversation. And strangely enough, we were talking about that exact same thing at our SHE exec committee meeting just before this, because that's one thing I would say to everybody is please watch out for an unintentional divide and a them and us scenario. You know, them could be anybody from those on the front line to those in the public domain versus those who are in offices or working from home. I think what we've done is work really hard to make sure that anything we've done in terms of initiatives or any messaging we've given out, it applies equally to everybody. You know, it's got to be consistent, but the main thing is it's got to show empathy with the people that the messaging is going to, and we're getting people to work in groups that are deliberately mixed up to make sure that people can understand each other's point of view. And you're absolutely right, Louise, there is no one size fits all in this. It is about bringing the whole person and the whole organisation approach together from whatever diversity people are coming from in terms of their working location, what they do as a role, them as an individual. There shouldn't be any barriers anymore, and COVID has sort of proven that it's easier to actually remove some of those barriers than perhaps it was before. So hybrid ways of working and it being okay to actually change what you did to one that, you know, to a situation that you're in now, and focusing on outputs and not inputs. That's really important in whatever way works for the organisations on this call.
I'll tell you what we haven't talked about is I would love you to share a bit more about your leading indicators in terms of driving behavioural change. Would you mind saying a bit more about that?
Sure. So we have a dashboard, as obviously most people do. With it's an automated dashboard that gathers forward-looking data that provides us trend analysis of what's coming down the road, as opposed to a constant focus on where we've already been. Because you need to learn from those things, but actually looking ahead gives you a much wider opportunity to adjust your pathway to suit. So our safety, health and environment metrics are all focused on leading type indicators. And one, as I've already mentioned, is engagement. The more that we can see people are submitting reports on good things, bad things, incidents, accidents, all the sort of traditional stuff, but also monitoring things like EAP use, interactions between mental health first aiders and individuals. All of those things can actually be used to give you an impression of what the future might be looking like, so you can plan for it and be ready for it, as we were with COVID, rather than having to run around in a panic scenario.
Yeah, no, great, thanks for that. So obviously we're now entering a second phase of COVID, and I'd be really interested to know kind of what you've learned in terms of supporting mental health during, what constructive lessons did you learn during the previous 7 months, and in terms of what you're planning for at least the short to medium term in terms of keeping that support going. What have you got planned, Lawrence?
Sure. Well, the first thing for me is it's such a cliche to say it, but make sure that your business is leading by example, because there is nothing worse than senior people in the business saying throughout this terrible pandemic, there's nothing more important than your well-being and what have you, and then sending you an email at 5 to midnight on a Sunday. And the day's horribly getting longer, and more meetings and more meetings and more pressure, because that is not the place where you want to be as an organisation. We've learned that the communication and the connectivity is absolutely sort of key to staying on top of this, but don't reduce your standards, because we looked back in March at what the government was proposing, and we made a conscious decision then to say that is the standard we'll work to, because it gives you consistency. It stops people over here doing one thing, people over there doing something else, and people over here doing a third version of what was originally just one thing. So the more you can nail those things down through really good communication and an approach that takes into account people's sort of situations and their feedback as well, the better off you'll be. And that is an absolute key learning point for us. We haven't changed our standards. We haven't reduced things down to the 1 metre rule. We've done none of that. We've kept it consistent, because once you've changed your behaviours to the extent that we have, you don't want to open up the opportunities for things to start creep backwards, because you'll end up with complacency. In terms of going forward, do you know what? It's going to be more of the same for that exact reason. We've completely rewritten our procedures and all of the sort of typical systems things that you would expect to see around, again, dynamic working, being much more flexible, hybrid ways of operating. We've introduced a personal energy management charter, which was a really good way of giving a consistent message to everybody in the business to let them know that they are actually empowered to manage their workload with their line manager in a way that suits them, because it's about the outputs, not the inputs. So locally, lots of teams have said, right, okay, no emails after that time of the day, or we're always going to make sure that everybody enforces a break during the day. Or for those working at home, line managers are constantly checking in saying, have you remembered to have a drink today? Have you remembered that you need to go and use the facilities? The basics we take for granted. So we've been a lot more clear about that going forward, and we've taken the ideas of our stakeholders, our internal and external stakeholders. So we have buy-in.
Yeah, no, brilliant. I wanted to hear a little bit more about, when we had our kind of pre-call, we talked quite a lot about the importance of empathy and compassion. And, it's not at the expense of commercial success. And obviously to do with Tony Bickerstaff, who's your Chief Financial Officer, who's also your champion, your senior boardroom champion for Wellbeing, is, he doesn't talk about the kind of business case. He also talks about the kind of human case. And in terms of his leadership and other execs at Costain, could you say a little more about how empathy and compassion manifests itself?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, Tony's always said, again, it's a bit of a cliche, but I believed it in my sort of 25, 26 year career, that people are the greatest asset that any organisation has. And if your people are not well, by implication, your organisation will not be well either. And you know that things like productivity and what have you are going to reduce. So we've been very focused as an organisation through the leadership of the board to make sure that is a consistent message wherever we go, and that feeds up into our client base, but also across into our supply chain as well. So it's consistent, you know, wherever you move within the organisation. I think the use of things like case studies to actually illustrate what we mean by that is useful, because it brings a little bit of realism to something that could just be a badge or a statement. And we've even moved well-being to the forefront of our strategy a couple of years ago, to show that safety and health is always going to be important. Of course it is, but everything for our money actually sits under that banner of well-being. But you do have to understand your people and your stakeholders and what makes them tick. And you also have to be understanding and open to what feedback you get when you ask questions, which is where the compassion element comes in. I mean, I have a member of my team at the moment who unfortunately lost his wife very suddenly 2 weeks ago. And I spoke to him last night, and his comments to me were, this whole scenario has shown you just what a family feel Costain still has. He said, because I've got people ringing me or sending me messages, or, you know, getting a card, who I might have only met once or twice. He said, and that must have come about from this sort of 5-year journey we've been on, where everyone's really, really just open to putting an arm around somebody and saying, look, clearly you're not okay. So what can we do to help you? What can we do to help you help yourself? And people just sort of come together as groups. And without that empathy and without that compassion being genuine and being visible through the organisation, it doesn't really add up to much. So I'd say to everybody on the call, think about how you can turn that into something that's real for you, because it's so powerful, and it you know, it's essential to keep the well-being of employees on the straight and narrow.
That's brilliant. Lawrence, I've really enjoyed sitting in your lovely garden with your fire pit, and I'm really glad I wore my pink sweater. That actually works very nicely. And I'd like to end 2 questions. First of all, let's get onto the $1 million question, based on kind of the last extraordinary 7 months. Is, what are the 3 kind of practical actions you'd encourage any organisation listening to us now, and they can do right now to proactively ensure work design and organisational culture drive positive mental outcomes? And then I'll ask you a final question after that.
So the first thing, I mean, we signed up to the mental health at work commitment some time ago, but I would honestly say that we're at a point now where if you were to take that commitment to one side and have an open and honest gap analysis of where you are as an organisation against that commitment, and especially in relation to what we're talking about today, standard 2, but an open and honest review of that, what that will do is not only give you a really good steer in terms of where you are now, just going through that process and thinking about what you need to do next, all sorts of other opportunities with different parts of the business, the opportunities for connectivity, the behavioural stuff I've talked about earlier. You'll find that, you know, immensely important. But the second thing that you need to do alongside that is go and speak to people and see what they think, because you can come up with as many great, fantastic ideas as you like that you think is going to solve the world's problems. But if all those people you're trying to bring along with you on the journey go, sorry, I don't get it, that's not what I think, or that's not right for us, or whatever it might be, then I'm afraid, you know, you're shooting yourselves in the foot. So take the opportunity to go and speak to people. Simple things like poll surveys that will give you really quick turnarounds. We had a stand down recently to talk about what everybody across our business, including our supply chain, which altogether is 17,500 people, what do they think makes a really good line manager? What do they think could help us with job design to make sure that well-being is integral? And the next thing is, what do they think in their world within Costain they can do individually or as teams to make a difference? we've collated it all. And the third thing would be feed all that back and come up with a reasonably long-term strategy where you sort of eat the elephant in small chunks, but it's based on the mental health at work commitment. So you know that you've actually got an end game. But go and ask, do your gap analysis and go and ask. Those are the two things you could do in the next couple of weeks.
That's fantastic and really tangible, practical advice. Really great. Thank you. And just last question, personal question is, I know you've just come back from holiday, so you're not one of those 35% who don't take annual leave. So what else, just quickly, what are the kind of 3 things that actually you do to look after your mental health, Lawrence?
I personally have to really keep an eye on the fact that, because I've been working at home for so long, that my days haven't started at 6 o'clock in the morning and are now finishing at 8 o'clock at night, because now I've lost the commute. It will be really easy to actually just backfill that with more work time. Don't do it, because it doesn't improve your productivity. I tend to find that when I'm under just a little bit more pressure, actually I become much more focused, and that helps me personally. I always, every day, irrespective of the weather, I go out first thing in the morning, 3/4 of an hour, long walk. I'd like to say run, but my body's not built for running so much. And always do that every day, because it gives you headspace. It gives you an opportunity to just go out, get some deep breaths, be out there in the environment, in the real world, not stuck in a little office somewhere. To me, that's absolutely essential. And 3, don't forget the people around you as well. I check in with my family. I check in with work colleagues, my friends, as often as I can, because not only does that make them feel connected, it keeps you feeling connected as well. And you'll realise you're not on your own. We're all suffering different impacts from the COVID scenario, but we are all suffering one way or another. So keep in touch with people.
Yeah. Lawrence, it's been an absolute pleasure sitting in your gorgeous garden. I just wish we could have had like you said, a few marshmallows.
Yeah, sorry.
And actually would have worked with the pink as well. Thank you for your generosity and taking the time to share from your experience. Very much appreciated. And thank you. And I'd now like to hand back to Faye, please.
Brilliant. Yeah, I just echo what Louise said. That was absolutely fantastic. And I think it's so important on these webinars where we start with the context, which can sometimes feel difficult to hear, but then we actually bring that really positive view and practical advice, so that actually people can leave and think, actually, we can make a difference, we can make the change. And I think, Lawrence, you have just given some wonderful examples of how that can happen. So thank you. So I'm now going to ask Ewan to read out some of the questions in the chat. He's been keeping an eye on them and hopefully kind of theming them. So Lawrence, Louise and I will be now answering some questions from the chat.
Yes, hello there. Thank you to those who are joining me over in the world of text during that. I'm just going to answer one question straight away because it's the easiest, and then we'll get back to the good stuff. A few people asked whether the previous webinars are available to watch. Yes, we're putting them on the website as we go along. It takes a day or two to process, but I am now pasting the link into the chat room. It's back to the same page where you signed up for these webinars. One at a time, I'm putting the videos in there. However, onto the interesting things. So I thought we'd start with a few that were more directed towards Lawrence, as he's here and just been speaking. How do you combat survey fatigue? We don't want to overwhelm employees with frequent surveys, as we think they will lose their importance.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I've been pushing to do small, regular wellbeing pulse surveys for a while, and there was always pushback for exactly that reason. So every 2 years we do an employee engagement survey. But I think I've been able to demonstrate that by doing small, chunky surveys that we got such a great response from last time, by not making them huge, not making them massively time consuming, but pinpointed where we know we can actually have really good impacts. Doing it in sort of smaller chunks, but not allowing everyone else to jump on that same bandwagon has actually paid dividends to us. So I would say I completely agree with you. So think about your comm strategy and what it is that others in your business actually want to do. And if you can, try and dovetail them together to avoid that. If you can't, then think about those things that are going to give you the biggest impact. And for us, the Wellbeing Pulse surveys, yeah, it's been fantastic.
Can I just add a point there? I think a lot of the feedback we get about survey fatigue is the fact that people don't often then hear what's happened with the information that they've put into that survey. So, you know, the very simple rule, you know, you said, we heard, we did. Yeah. And even if you didn't do it all, why didn't you? And I think actually that encourages people to think, well, next time we fill out the survey, we'll at least know what's happened and progress has been made. So I think it's really important to remember that often that fatigue is because stuff is not then fed back or done with it.
From a behavioural point of view, it's absolutely sound. Otherwise, people will go into extinction and just start pressing the delete button before they've even seen what the survey's about. So absolutely.
Go into extinction like that. So we had a couple of ones I put together to do with sharing of resources, really. Claire said she loved the sound of the Wellbeing Charter and was wondering whether you would be willing to share. But also somebody else said it would be interesting to hear the questions that both you and Eon had asked their employees and in what format.
Yeah, I think, I'll be happy to speak to anybody, share anything. I mean, just yesterday I shared the Wellbeing Charter and also our health maturity matrix that moved us from the occupational health world into a wellbeing world over a 3-year sort of period. I'm happy to share all of this stuff. So absolutely, it's too good to go now, but yeah.
That sounds like something we might put on Mental Health at Work, the rest of the site actually for people to find. That would be great, thank you. Other things, we've got a few questions about Eon, who I'm aware that they're not here, so perhaps I'll go through them all, and Faye, if you happen to know the answers to any of them, we'll deal with them all at once. Would that be okay?
Yeah.
So first of all, somebody asked, what's the difference between the role of the wellbeing warrior and a wellbeing leader? Also, are the wellbeing warriors full-time members of the team, or is it a bolt-on to their day job? And finally, anything about Eon's experience of the need for communications between a performance manager and a wellbeing manager in this kind of dual management approach? Do you anything on those?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the differences, I think what we recognise is that every organisation calls these types of roles something different. So whether it's mental health champions, wellbeing warriors, mental health first aiders, mental health leaders. So every organisation will have a spin on this type of role. And broadly speaking, you know, the roles are often around raising awareness, being a listening ear, being able to signpost, and being that role that actually really helps tackle the stigma within workplaces about mental health. So it's usually, you know, the roles will differ in each organisation. It's just that some organisations like to call them different names. In terms of whether this is a full-time role, so they're not full-time roles. So essentially what Eon do is they go through quite a rigid sort of selection process. But the main requirement for that is that people have lived experience and enthusiasm and really want to kind of make a difference in this area. And they actually had 135 applications in the organisations for 30 places. So they decided to do a sort of a double intake on that. But each warrior is given 3 hours per month to either have individual conversations, run events, or post on the internet, or do more of the strategic work. So they have 3 hours out of their workday where they're able to focus on this. And then what they also do is each quarter there's a meeting where every warrior has 5 minutes to sort of talk about what they've been working on and share best practice and get feedback from each other. So it's not kind of a permanent role, but they're given time out of their workday to actually do this work. So hopefully that's answered the bulk of that.
Oh, thank you. So then I mean, we may end up with a minute or two spare if anyone wants to write anything else in now, but the last two were following Louise's taking us through of that research at the beginning. First of all, what was the source of the stats that you took us through? Was it research done by business in the community or a third party? And also, were there any statistics on people believing they have been discriminated against due to their mental health condition?
Hi there. So the data, the survey was conducted by YouGov using a panel of over 3,500. So in terms of being statistically valid, it wasn't self-selecting and it was done online. In terms of basically the different cuts of the data, at the moment we've only done a high level cut, which is what I've shared with you just now, but we are going to be doing subsequent data mining in terms of looking at kind of issues around inclusion. So basically watch this space, but we're going to kind of drip feed it I know that the survey last year had a lot more in the kind of launch report around race, gender, age, and LGBT+. That information will come out, but just over time.
If we've got just a minute left, can I just add a point to what was just said about mental health first aiders and sort of wellbeing warriors, champions, whatever? Because we've got a very similar structure, and we have a wellbeing network that is effectively overseen by it's a wellbeing steering group, and that's what we use as our sort of instigator for everything, and it's shared by our CFO, as I said earlier. And the idea of that is to make sure that we have representatives right across our business to make sure that wherever the likes of a mental health first aider or a wellbeing champion crop up, that it's representative of those different bits of the business, to make sure that everybody has had input. But what I will say is that make sure, if that's the road you go down, you must put a support network in place for them. Because if you think back to the first ever Superman film, for those who can remember back to the late 70s, there's a shot of Superman taking Lois Lane for a fly around the skyline of New York for the first time ever, and she's clearly terrified, as I think most of us would be. You know, he says, "Don't worry, I've got you," and she says, "Well, you know, okay, so you've got me, but who's got you?" And when you're sort of in this mental health support role, it's really important to remember that there are people out there who also have their own issues that they have to manage. So please make sure you've got a method in place to make sure you're looking after them while they're actually driving initiatives and looking after others.
Oh, thank you. Seems like a perfect point to end on. I think we've reached the end of the questions. So over to you, Faye.
Yeah, great, thank you. That's a really, really good point. So yes, we've come to the end of the webinar. I just want to say a massive thank you to Louise and Lawrence. That's been so insightful and so brilliant. And thank you for everybody for joining. This is the second webinar of the series. So I know that some people have signed up to all 6. So we look forward to seeing you on future ones if you have. As we've said, the recordings will all be on the Mental Health at Work website. And that website is essentially the first stop for anybody that wants to know anything about workplace mental health. So please do use it. Use Mind, use Business in the Community. We're here to help. You don't have to do this on your own. But the one key takeaway is sign up to that Mental Health at Work commitment. Start on the journey. If you're already on the journey, progress your journey. And we're here to support you. So thank you so much for joining, and have a brilliant rest of the day.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye.